There are more than 137,000 rental units in the city of Detroit, so you can't talk about housing in the city and healthy housing without talking about rentals and landlords. A recent push by the city of Detroit to register properties for health and safety compliance netted just 6,000 of 42,000 landlords signing up at least one property. So in order to get better quality housing for residents, we need to understand what's on the ground. According to a report by Detroit Future City that we're going to talk about today, 90% of Detroit's housing was constructed before 1980, and a third more was built at least 80 years ago. And that means nearly 85% that possibly could contain lead paint, a real health hazard for children. So on your Daily Detroit, sharing what to know and where to go around Metro Detroit, let's get into that discussion. I'm Jer Stays. It is Thursday, November 17th, 2022. After our feature conversation, I'll share a few things you should know around town. Let's get started. Joining me virtually, Ashley Clarke and Edward Lynch from Detroit Future City to talk about this report, Understanding the Rental Landscape, a profile analysis of Detroit landlords to inform lead safe housing policy. It's a long title, but it actually has a lot of interesting information, especially in a city like Detroit. So why don't we set the table for people who have not approached this report before, or they rent a place in Detroit, or they've thought about Detroit. Why is it important to focus on this landscape of landlords and tenants?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jer. And so, many of us have been renters ourselves, and we've experienced different types of landlords, different types of living situations, and we know how our housing quality can impact our quality of life and our well-being. And in Detroit is it's a majority renter city. And so that means the majority of our housing units are occupied by renters. So that means if we care about quality housing in our community, if we care about the health and well-being of our community, we have to look to our rental stock. While housing conditions are certainly a priority and prevalent in both kind of our owner-occupied and renter-occupied properties, what we found is that there's a real lack of data on who owns rental housing in Detroit. And this information gap, it inspired the City of Detroit's Housing and Revitalization Department to partner with Detroit Future City and Data Driven Detroit to develop this study. And the goal of it is to really provide an accurate picture of the landlord landscape in Detroit. Because, again, to create a healthy community where all residents can have a good quality of life, it's imperative that we understand this rental housing system and who owns the city's rental housing stock so that we can begin to really address the condition of rental housing in the city. Our hope, our intent is that the information in the report can be used to set a common understanding of Detroit's landlords. And in doing so, by providing this kind of baseline data, the community partners can use it to inform the development of more effective programs and resources to support landlords in providing healthier and safer housing.
That makes a lot of sense, especially considering, there was this recent initiative by the city of Detroit to bring a lot of places into compliance. Some have said it's among the more, I don't want to necessarily use the word strict, but complete registration programs in the city as far as needing to make sure that you have lead abatement and all these other things. However, uptake on that program wasn't exactly the best, and we still have a large number of rental houses that just didn't get brought into the program at all. And it feels like this kind of information of knowing who these landlords are might be able to help with future programs like this or other things to deal with renters.
Definitely. Yeah. So if we think about our housing stock, and if we think about, to that point about housing quality, so for the City of Detroit's current landlord policy, it requires that landlords are required to register the rental properties. And if the property is built before 1978, it has to undergo a lead inspection, a risk assessment, and then if lead-based paint hazards are found, it has to go through a clearance exam. And why this is important is that housing built prior to 1978, which was when lead paint was banned, has an increased risk of exposing children to lead. And we have about 90% of Detroit's housing was constructed before 1980, and a third was built prior to 1940. So it's estimated that about 85% of these housing units still contain lead-based paint. And so while this older housing stock, it is part of Detroit's cultural history, it also requires this investment to be a healthy and sustainable place for residents to live. And so as we think about the fact that we have a large share of housing that likely still has lead-based paint in it, and we have this landlord policy that is intended to help bring all of this housing into a place that's safer for households to live in, that's really important. But what we find is that the combination of stringent requirements, low property values, the rent commanded by substandard rental properties, that can make compliance with current regulations really challenging and sometimes financially infeasible for many landlords, even though we know that this really should be a requirement for our housing. And so in turn, you have landlords who choose not to register their properties. So the hope is that if we can get a better picture of who these landlords are, we can get a sense of they're smaller landlords, bigger landlords, different ways they interact with the city already. We can say, all right, how do we need to support these different types of landlords to help bring them into compliance with the landlord policy so we get this safe housing? Because it's not going to be a one size fits all solution, right? Different people need different supports. And so this is that very first step in just saying, what do the data say? What are the characteristics of these landlords? And it's that jumping off point to then be able to say, all right, what do we need to do? What programs, what resources, what funds do different landlords need so we can make this housing healthier?
Well, let's talk about those types of landlords. What is the situation, Troy, when it comes to individual ownership, corporate ownership? You go to different cities and you see large groups developing, large projects and many properties. Other places, you have a lot of, say, single, mom and pop, for lack of a better term, where they own one property or they, live in the duplex downstairs and, rent the upstairs or something like that. What's kind of that topography?
What we've found out is that some of these basic questions, like there's 42,000 individual landlords that are responsible for owning the city's about 137,000 rental units. That's something we did not know before. And kind of another big takeaway is of these 42,000 landlords owning the city's rental housing stock, about 87% of these landlords really own one or two properties.
Mm. And I imagine that has a lot of knock-on effects because when you only own one property or a couple, the financial resources you have are limited. And also depending on where you're from, is this something where you've learned where some of those individual landlords are living?
About 64% of the landlords that we were able to identify have a Detroit address. So it's a whole lot of local ownership out there.
Mm. With that local ownership, just from a business perspective, because I do a lot of business reporting, resources are difficult sometimes to come by. You don't have the giant access to capital a lot of times to do a full house rehab. And then on top of that, you all were talking about the amount of money that you can charge. I mean, this starts to become kind of like a interlocking thing that, if you can only charge so much for your rent, you can't really pay for a bunch of improvements. On the other hand, to a lot of people, that affordable rent is really crucial to them. It kind of feels like this kind of interlocking mess right here.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly, I think you've landed on what the conundrum is, right? That we need to have this healthy housing. There's a challenge of how much landlords can charge the cost of improvements. And so again, this is this opportunity to say, all right, there's different things that these small, 1 to 2 property owning mom and pop landlords might need in terms of supports compared to our larger property owners. And so the goal is that this can really start that conversation to figure out what are those resources needed, or is it awareness, financial, whatever it may be, in order to support those landlords. Recognizing that, landlords should equally want to be able to be providing safe housing and be part of supporting families and their success. And so I think it's also a launching point for us to say, how can we work with landlords to identify what their needs are, so we can make this a healthy partnership. Again, this data really is that baseline, letting us know, here are the 4 different types of landlords. And then the goal is for people to use this information to figure out the targeting of those resources, the designing of those programs to be able to support those landlords and help bring those properties into compliance.
Yeah, I think the detail of this data is really important because you see the coverage downtown and you think oh, it's these towers and there's all these units getting done. But in reality, in most of Detroit, it is that mom and pop situation, which I got to imagine is going to be a challenge to get their hands around with from a policy perspective, even though I know that's a little bit outside of the scope of the report as far as like policy recommendations. It's more of, this is the situation. What are your hopes for the next steps with this report? And what do you hope happens next? Who do you hope takes this up and takes a look at it and says, okay, we're going to start developing something to interface and deal with people?
I think this is certainly something that is going to take different actors and different partners. So I think there's opportunities for the city, opportunities for community development organizations, opportunities for landlords to come to the table and to be a partner in this. And, in terms of my hopes, one of the things we found is that only 2% of the largest group of landlords, so those that own one or two properties, are registered with the city. It would be great to revisit this data and to see in the next several years a shift in that number. And again, I think to see that shift and to make that progress, it's going to require multiple actors coordinating and thinking through different and innovative solutions. But I think the solution doesn't lie with one group alone. There's certainly opportunities for a variety of actors to play a role.
Well, I mean, when you're talking about any complex issue, I know the public sometimes likes to look at a silver bullet and say, well, if we just did this one thing. But in reality, when you want to deploy policy and you want to make change, it often takes multiple levels working together, and the work is challenging but valuable.
Exactly. And I think it's something where it's important to work collaboratively together. It's important to recognize that there are landlords who want to do the right thing and need support getting there. And so to the extent that you can get landlords, tenants, the city to a table to really think about those solutions, I think will benefit us and result in stronger policies and programs as a result. Our hope is that people can really use this information to inform their understanding of landlords. And I would also offer, we have printed copies of the report available. And so if you go to DFC's website, anyone is welcome to request a copy and we'll mail it to you for free.
Absolutely. And it's also up there as a PDF as well, right?
Yes.
Absolutely. All right, Ashley Clarke, Edward Lynch, thank you so much for your time on Daily Detroit. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Jared.
Here are 4 stories to know around Metro Detroit. The second story may be sensitive for younger ears, so discretion is advised. First, the mayor of Westland, Bill Wild, has unexpectedly said he will resign at the end of this year after 16 years in office. He just won a landslide re-election victory earlier this month with 72% of the vote, but is opting to take a job in the private sector. He's going to become the president and CEO of the Midwest Independent Retailers Association, who lobbies for independent supermarkets, convenience stores, gas stations, specialty food markets, and businesses that support them. Westland is a suburb in western Wayne County, just south of Livonia, that now has more than 85,000 people across nearly 21 square miles, giving it a population density just a bit shy of the city of Detroit. Second, an unprocessed backlog of more than 11,000 rape kits have finally been tested. In a press release, the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office says the kits date from 2009 all the way back to 1984. The kits were found in a Detroit Police Department warehouse in 2009, and more than 4,800 cases have been closed with the identification of 841 suspected serial rapists and 239 convictions. Third, the city of Grosse Pointe may be getting a new 81-unit apartment building near an area that's called The Village, and just a couple of blocks away from Grosse Pointe's Beaumont Hospital. The land behind a CVS, according to the Grosse Pointe News, has been vacant for about a decade and a half. It would also include about 3,000 square feet of commercial space and some sort of shared surface parking deal. It goes before the local city council in December. This is on the heels of a multi-story, multi-building development plan announced at the Detroit-Grosse Pointe border recently. A number of longtime suburbs like Royal Oak, Sterling Heights, and Dearborn are also adding some density to help keep property values up and population numbers strong to reinforce their tax base. Plus, younger talent is more and more looking for walkability, more than you'll find in most of Metro Detroit right now. And finally, the Detroit Free Press reports that there is a new 4-story apartment building proposed for the corner of 2nd and Brainerd in Midtown Detroit. It'd have nearly 60 units and be built on a site that now has a series of solar panels. Those solar panels helped power an illegal marijuana grow operation that the Detroit Fire Department said caused a fire in the apartment building next door back in 2020. This new development announced is under new owners, and that fire-damaged building is now taking tenants again. And we are done for today. Tomorrow, Devin O'Reilly joins me for our Fun Friday edition. We've got some great stories to share and things to talk about. If you find what we do valuable, consider joining us as a member like Waylon did at patreon.com/dailydetroit. That's patreon.com/dailydetroit. Waylon, you are awesome. With that, I'm Jer Stays. Remember that you are somebody, and I'll see you around Detroit.